There's nothing more painful than watching your own family turn their backs on you when you need them most. When people you've loved your whole life suddenly look at you like you're a fool, it cuts deeper than any stranger's words ever could. Levi Brenneman felt this sting when his wealthy uncle died and left him a falling-down farm in Lancaster County. His brother laughed at him. His cousins called it worthless. Even his neighbors shook their heads at what they saw as a cruel joke. The barn was ready to collapse, the fields were empty, and the house leaked when it rained. Everyone told Levi to sell it and walk away. But something inside him wouldn't give up on that old place. While his family mocked him for wasting his time, he quietly began fixing what was broken. What he found buried beneath that crumbling barn would silence every laugh and change everything. His discovery would prove that sometimes the things people throw away hold the greatest treasures, but it would also show him that when money enters the picture, even family can become strangers. What secret had been hidden on that land for generations that would turn his simple world upside down? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist hung low over the Pennsylvania countryside like a gentle blessing, but Levi Brenneman barely noticed its beauty as he walked the fence line of what everyone called the burden. That's what his brother Jacob had taken to calling Uncle Samuel's farm, a burden that no sensible man would want to carry. The October air carried the scent of wood smoke from distant chimneys and the earthy smell of leaves beginning their final turn. In another time, on another morning, Levi might have paused to appreciate God's handiwork spread across the rolling hills of Lancaster County. Today, his mind was elsewhere, wrestling with decisions that seemed too heavy for one man's shoulders. At 42, Levi had the weathered hands of a man who had worked the soil his entire life, and the patient eyes of someone who understood that good things take time to grow. His beard, now more gray than brown, framed a face that neighbors had always described as trustworthy. Sarah often teased him that he looked like the kind of man people confided their troubles to, and she wasn't wrong. Over the years, more than one neighbor had found their way to Levi's kitchen table, seeking advice or simply a listening ear. The Brenneman farm, where Levi had built his life with Sarah, was modest but well maintained. Their white farmhouse, with its simple lines and practical design, sat comfortably among mature oak trees that had shaded 3 generations of his family. The barn was solid, painted the traditional red that dotted the landscape like familiar punctuation marks. Their fields, though not extensive, provided enough corn and hay to support their small dairy operation and leave a little extra for the local market. But Uncle Samuel's place, the inheritance that had divided his family and set tongues wagging throughout their church district, was a different story entirely. The 2-story house sagged in the middle like an old horse with a broken back. Shingles hung loose or had fallen away completely, leaving dark patches where rain had stained the weathered wood. The wraparound porch that had once been the farm's pride tilted at an angle that made visitors wonder if it might collapse under their feet. Windows were cracked, some boarded up with plywood that had long since warped and split. The barn was even worse. Its red paint had faded to the color of dried blood, and the roof dipped in places where support beams had given way. The silo beside it leaned at such a pronounced angle that Jacob had joked it looked like the Tower of Pisa. The fencing was a patchwork of different eras, some original post and rail, some newer wire mesh, and some sections held together with nothing more than hope and stubbornness. Sarah had stood beside him 3 weeks ago when they first walked through the property after the funeral. She was a woman of few words, but deep understanding, and Levi valued her counsel above all others. At 38, she still moved with the quick efficiency of someone who had learned early to make the most of every daylight hour. Her brown hair, always neatly pinned beneath her prayer covering, had begun showing threads of silver that she wore like badges of honor, earned through years of partnership in both work and faith. "It's worse than I remembered," she had said quietly. Her, practical eyes taking in the scope of the work that lay ahead. The foundation looks sound on the house, but that barn, she shook her head, that barn is barely standing. Levi had nodded, understanding the weight of her unspoken concerns. They weren't wealthy people. The inheritance of this broken-down farm meant taking on expenses they could barely afford, time away from their own property, and the certainty of years of hard labor with no guarantee of success. Any sensible person would sell it and use whatever money they could get to improve their own situation. But Levi wasn't just anyone, and this wasn't just any farm. This was the place where his grandfather had been born, where 4 generations of Brennemans had lived and worked before Uncle Samuel became the last of his line to call it home. Family history ran deep in these fields, deeper than the practical concerns that kept him awake at night. The family Bible that now sat on Levi's kitchen table had come with the inheritance, a heavy leather-bound volume that Samuel had treasured above all his other possessions. Its pages were yellowed with age and filled with pressed flowers and handwritten notes spanning more than a century. Birth dates, death dates, marriage records and small observations about weather and crops created a chronicle of lives lived, simply but with purpose. It was in that Bible that Levi had first sensed there might be more to Samuel's gift than met the eye. Between the pages of Genesis, he had found a note in Samuel's careful handwriting, for the one who sees beyond what is broken to what can be restored. The foundation remembers what the surface has forgotten. Jacob had laughed when Levi showed him the note. The old man was getting strange in his final years, he had said dismissively, living alone in that falling-down house, talking to himself. It's just the ramblings of someone who spent too much time in his own company. But Levi wasn't so sure. Samuel had been sharp right up until the end, managing his business affairs with the same precision he had always shown. The lawyers had been surprised by how meticulously organized his papers were, how carefully he had planned for the transfer of property. A man with that kind of foresight didn't leave cryptic messages without reason. The family meeting 2 weeks ago had been harder than Levi expected. Jacob had arrived with their cousins, David and Samuel, named for the uncle who had just passed, along with their wives and older children. The living room of Levi's house had felt crowded and tense as Jacob laid out what he called the sensible solution. "We all know that farm isn't worth the taxes you'll pay on it," Jacob had begun, his voice carrying the authority he had always assumed as the older brother. "The smart thing is to sell it quick before you throw good money after bad, trying to fix what can't be fixed. Split whatever we get and put it towards something useful." David had nodded eagerly. "I've got a contact in real estate development. Says there might be some interest from companies looking for warehouse space. The location is decent, even if the buildings aren't worth saving." "Warehouse space," Sarah had repeated quietly, and Levi had heard the sadness in her voice. She understood, even if the others didn't, what it meant to turn a family farm into commercial property. Cousin Samuel, barely 25 and full of certainty about things he had never experienced, had leaned forward with the enthusiasm of youth. "Uncle Levi, you've got to think practically. What are you going to do with that place? You can't farm it, the soil's been neglected for years. You can't afford to fix the buildings. All you're doing is taking on debt and responsibility for something that's never going to pay you back." The room had grown quiet then, all eyes on Levi as they waited for him to acknowledge the obvious truth of their arguments. These were people he loved, people whose opinions mattered to him. They weren't being cruel or greedy. They genuinely believed they were helping him avoid a costly mistake. But as Levi had looked around that room, something had stirred in him that he couldn't quite name. It wasn't stubbornness exactly, though he knew that's what they would call it. It was more like recognition, as if something deep in his chest was responding to a call only he could hear. "I appreciate your concern," he had said finally, his voice carrying the same quiet strength that had served him well through 42 years of life. "But I'm not ready to sell. Not yet." The response had been immediate and sharp. Jacob's face had darkened with the kind of anger that comes when someone you care about refuses to listen to reason. Levi, this is foolish. You're going to bankrupt yourself and Sarah trying to save something that died years ago. It's not dead, Levi had replied simply. It's just sleeping. The laughter that followed wasn't kind. David and young Samuel had exchanged glances that spoke louder than words about what they thought of their cousin's romantic notions. Even some of the wives had smiled behind their hands at what they saw as typical male foolishness. But Sarah had reached over and taken his hand, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture of support that had meant more to him than all their practical arguments combined. She had said nothing, but her touch had told him that whatever he decided, she would stand with him. That had been 2 weeks ago, and since then, Levi had spent every spare moment at the inherited farm, walking the property, examining the buildings, and trying to understand what Samuel had wanted him to see. The more time he spent there, the more convinced he became that the old man's final gift was more than it appeared to be. The house, despite its shabby exterior, was built on a foundation of hand-cut stone that showed the craftsmanship of an earlier era. The barn, for all its obvious problems, had been constructed with massive timbers that were still sound beneath their weathered surface. Even the fields, though overgrown with weeds and volunteer trees, showed signs of soil that had once been fertile and could be again. More puzzling were the small details that didn't quite fit. The property boundaries, according to the deed, included more acreage than seemed obvious from casual observation. There were old fence lines that didn't match the current layout, suggesting the farm had once been configured differently. And in the basement of the house, Levi had found evidence that Samuel had been more active in his final years than anyone realized. Boxes of papers, old surveys, and what appeared to be research into the farm's history. It was there, in that musty basement, that he had found the family Bible wasn't the only thing Samuel had preserved. Wrapped in oilcloth and stored in a cedar chest were documents that went back generations. Land grants, survey maps, and correspondence that painted a picture of his ancestors he had never known existed. The Brenneman family, according to these papers, hadn't always been simple farmers. There were references to business dealings, investments, and activities that suggested a complexity to their history that had been lost or deliberately forgotten over time. One letter, dated 1923, mentioned the security of what lies beneath, and advised discretion in all family matters related to the foundation. As October evenings grew longer and the work on his own farm demanded attention, Levi found his thoughts returning again and again to those cryptic references. Samuel had been trying to tell him something. He was certain of that now. The question was whether he would be wise enough to understand the message before family pressure and financial reality forced him to give up the search. Walking back toward his truck in the fading afternoon light, Levi paused to look once more at the sagging barn and broken fences that had become the center of so much family conflict. To everyone else, it was a burden, a costly mistake, a romantic folly that would drain his resources and break his spirit. But as the setting sun painted the weathered buildings in shades of gold and amber, Levi saw something different. He saw possibility. He saw the patient work of restoration that might reveal treasures hidden beneath decades of neglect. And he saw the fulfillment of a promise made by one generation to another, a promise that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as the heaviest burdens. Tomorrow he would begin the real work. Tonight he would go home to Sarah and try to explain why his heart insisted on hope, when his head knew better than to believe in mysteries and hidden meanings. But first, he would stand here for just a moment longer, listening for the whisper of wisdom that had guided generations of his family through challenges far greater than a broken-down farm, and the doubts of those who loved him. The November morning when everything changed began like any other. Levi had risen before dawn to tend his own animals before heading to Samuel's farm, where he had been spending 3 or 4 hours each day clearing brush and assessing what could be salvaged. Sarah had packed him a thermos of coffee and 2 sandwiches, kissing his cheek with the resigned affection of a woman who had learned that some battles weren't worth fighting. "Be careful in that old house," she had said, as she did every morning. "Those floorboards upstairs aren't sound, and I worry about you working alone over there." He had promised to be cautious, as he always did, and headed out into the crisp air that carried the scent of coming winter. The leaves had mostly fallen now, carpeting the ground in shades of brown and gold, and the bare trees revealed the bones of the landscape in a way that summer's fullness had hidden. It was this stark November clarity that led to the discovery that would change everything. Levi had been working in Samuel's bedroom, pulling up sections of water-damaged flooring near the window where rain had leaked through for years. The wood underneath was solid oak, but decades of moisture had warped and stained the boards beyond repair. As he pried up a particularly stubborn plank, his crowbar struck something that didn't sound like the usual hollow space between floor joists. Kneeling down to investigate, he found a gap in the subflooring that revealed something wrapped in oilcloth, wedged between the structural beams. His heart quickened as he carefully worked the package free, recognizing the same type of protective wrapping he had found around the old documents in the basement. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with Samuel's careful handwriting, in both English and the Pennsylvania Dutch that older generations of their community still used for private thoughts. The entries were dated, spanning the last 15 years of Samuel's life, and as Levi began to read, he realized he was holding the key to mysteries that had puzzled him for weeks. The first entries were mundane: observations about weather, notes about repairs needed around the farm, complaints about rising taxes and declining health. But as Levi read deeper, the tone shifted to something more purposeful, more secretive. March 15th, 1995. Found father's old survey notes in the attic today. The measurements don't match what the county has on file. The barn foundation extends further east than anyone knows. Father was cleverer than I gave him credit for. June 3rd, 1997. Confirmed what I suspected about the property lines. The original grant was for twice what we've been paying taxes on. Someone in the family knew this once. Need to understand why it was hidden. September 12th, 2001. The calls are coming more frequent now. Third party this year asking about selling. They know something. Father's letter mentioned this might happen eventually. Time to dig deeper into what lies beneath. Levi's hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages. Samuel hadn't been a lonely old man rambling to himself. He had been conducting research, following clues left by previous generations, protecting something that others were actively seeking. The entries from recent years were more urgent. April 8th, 2007. Found the surveyor's compass in the barn wall. Father hid it well. The measurements lead to 3 specific points on the property. Whatever they buried, they marked it carefully. October 15th, 2009. The foundation stones aren't what they appear to be. Symbols carved into the east side that don't match anything from our usual builders. This farm is older than the family has admitted, and it was built for purposes beyond simple agriculture. January 22nd, 2012. They're watching the property now. Car with out-of-state plates parked on Millerville Road 3 times this month. Driver always seems to be taking pictures. Time is running short. Need to choose an heir who will understand the responsibility. The final entry was dated just 2 weeks before Samuel's death. November 3rd, 2012. Decision made. Levi has the patience and integrity to handle what's coming. Jacob would sell without understanding what he was giving away. Sarah will support her husband when he needs her strength. The foundation remembers what the surface has forgotten. The key is in the compass, and the compass points true. May God forgive me for the burden I'm placing on them. Levi sat back on his heels, the journal heavy in his hands, as the implications of what he had read settled over him. Samuel hadn't left him a broken-down farm. He had left him a puzzle that multiple generations of his family had been protecting. The mysterious visitors, the cryptic notes, the careful preservation of old documents. It all made sense now. But sense didn't make it any less overwhelming. He spent the next hour reading through the journal again, trying to absorb details that seemed to change everything he thought he knew about his family's history. References to what lies beneath appeared repeatedly, along with mentions of measurements, compass points, and something called the foundation account that Samuel checked on annually but never explained. By the time he closed the journal and rewrapped it in the oilcloth, Levi understood two things with absolute certainty. His uncle had discovered something significant on this property, and there were people outside the family who knew about it and wanted it for themselves. The drive home felt longer than usual, his mind spinning with questions that had no easy answers. Should he share this discovery with Sarah immediately, or take time to investigate further on his own? Should he tell Jacob and the cousins what he had found, or wait until he better understood what Samuel had been protecting? Most troubling of all was the realization that his decision to keep the farm hadn't just been about family sentiment or stubborn pride. Somehow, on a level deeper than conscious thought, he had sensed that Samuel's gift came with responsibilities that went beyond simple ownership. Sarah was waiting for him in the kitchen when he arrived, her face immediately showing concern at his expression. After 20 years of marriage, she could read his moods as easily as weather signs in the sky. "What happened?" she asked simply, setting down her mending and giving him her full attention. Levi pulled out a chair and sat down heavily, placing the wrapped journal on the table between them. "I found something today, something Samuel hid in the bedroom floor," as he recounted the discovery and shared key passages from the journal. Sarah's expression shifted from curiosity to concern to something approaching fear. She was a practical woman who had little patience for mysteries and complications, but she was also wise enough to recognize when circumstances demanded serious attention. "People have been watching the property," she asked when he finished. "For how long?" According to Samuel's notes, at least 5 years, maybe longer. Levi reached across the table and took her hand. "Sarah, I need you to know that if this becomes dangerous or too complicated, I'll walk away. Family history isn't worth risking your safety." She squeezed his fingers, her touch conveying both love and determination. "We don't walk away from responsibilities that God places in our path, but we also don't rush headlong into situations we don't understand." She paused, studying his face carefully. "What does your heart tell you about this?" It was a question only Sarah would think to ask, and the answer came without hesitation. That Samuel chose me for a reason, that there's something on that property worth protecting, and that running away now would dishonor not just him, but everyone in our family who kept this secret before us. Sarah nodded slowly, as if his answer confirmed something she had already suspected. "Then we need to be smart about how we proceed. No more working alone over there. And we need to understand what we're dealing with before we make any decisions about telling the others." As evening settled around their kitchen table, with Samuel's journal between them, like a bridge connecting past and present, Levi felt the weight of inherited responsibility settling onto his shoulders. He was no longer just a simple farmer trying to restore a neglected property. He had become the guardian of family secrets that reached back generations, and the next moves he made would determine whether those secrets remained protected or were lost forever. Outside, November wind rattled the windows, carrying the promise of winter and the whispered warnings of challenges yet to come. The surveyor's map that Levi found 3 days later changed everything he thought he knew about the property boundaries. Hidden behind a loose board in the barn wall, exactly where Samuel's journal had indicated, the old document revealed a truth that made his pulse quicken with both excitement and apprehension. According to the original land grant from 1847, The Brenneman property extended nearly twice as far east as the current fence lines suggested, encompassing sections of what neighboring families had been farming for decades. More puzzling still were the notations in the margins, measurements and angles that corresponded to specific landmarks, all marked with symbols that didn't appear on any modern survey. Sarah studied the map by lamplight at their kitchen table, her finger tracing the unusual markings that dotted the property like a code waiting to be deciphered. "These symbols here," she said, pointing to 3 distinctive marks near what appeared to be the barn's location. "They match the ones you described from Samuel's journal. And look," she turned the map to catch the light better, "there are lines connecting them, like they're marking specific points for some kind of measurement." Levi leaned closer, seeing what she meant. Faint pencil lines, barely visible after decades of aging, connected the 3 symbols in a triangle that encompassed most of the farm's central buildings. At each point, someone had written numbers that meant nothing to him, but had obviously been significant enough to preserve on the official document. "Samuel wrote about a compass," he said thoughtfully. "Something his father had hidden that would make sense of the measurements. If we could find that, we could understand what they were trying to mark," Sarah finished. "But Levi, before we go looking for more secrets, maybe we should think about what we already know. This map shows we own more land than we're paying taxes on. That alone could be valuable, especially if developers are interested in the area." It was a practical observation, the kind of clear thinking that had helped them navigate 20 years of marriage through good times and difficult ones. But even as Levi nodded agreement, he felt the pull of deeper mysteries that wouldn't be satisfied by simple financial calculations. The next morning brought an unwelcome confirmation that their discoveries were drawing attention from unwanted sources. As Levi arrived at Samuel's farm, he found Jacob waiting by the sagging front porch, his expression darker than the November sky that threatened early snow. "We need to talk," Jacob said without preamble, his tone carrying the kind of authority that had always made Levi feel like a younger brother, despite being only 3 years apart. "About what you're really doing over here every day." "I'm working on repairs," Levi replied carefully, not ready to share his recent discoveries until he better understood their implications. "Same as I told you last week." Jacob's laugh held no humor. "Repairs? Levi, I drove by here yesterday evening and saw your truck parked in that barn for 3 hours. What kind of repairs take 3 hours in a building that should probably be torn down?" The question hung between them like a challenge, and Levi realized that his careful work to avoid family scrutiny hadn't been as successful as he hoped. Jacob had always been observant, and their family's close-knit community made privacy difficult to maintain. "I'm trying to understand what Samuel wanted me to do with this place," Levi said finally, choosing words that were true without revealing everything. "There's more to it than just fixing what's broken." "More to it how?" Jacob pressed, stepping closer with the kind of intensity that had made him a successful businessman, but sometimes an exhausting brother. "Levi, people are talking." David heard from someone at the feed store that strangers have been asking questions about this property. Professional-looking people with cameras and measuring equipment. That information hit Levi like cold water. If outsiders were making their interest obvious enough for local gossip, then whatever Samuel had been protecting was drawing more attention than either of them had anticipated. "What kind of questions?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "About ownership, about whether it might be for sale, about the history of the buildings." Jacob paused, studying his brother's face intently. "Levi, what aren't you telling me? Because it's becoming clear that there's something about this place that you know and I don't." Before Levi could formulate an answer that wouldn't reveal too much or create more problems, a car approached on the gravel road that led to the farm. Both brothers turned to watch as a dark sedan with Pennsylvania plates, but unfamiliar to either of them, pulled up near the barn, Two men emerged, one older wearing an expensive-looking overcoat despite the mild weather, and one younger who immediately began taking photographs of the property with professional equipment. Neither seemed surprised to find the brothers there, which suggested this wasn't a casual visit. "Mr. Brenneman," the older man called, approaching with the kind of confident stride that spoke of successful business dealings and comfortable authority. "I'm hoping we could have a conversation about your property here." "Which Mr. Brenneman are you looking for?" Jacob replied, his natural suspicion of strangers evident in his tone. "The owner," the man said smoothly, extending his hand. "Robert Morrison Development Group. We specialize in land acquisition for commercial purposes. I understand there might be some interest in discussing a sale." Levi felt his chest tighten at the casual assumption that he would want to sell, but before he could respond, Jacob stepped forward with the kind of protective instinct that reminded Levi why, despite their disagreements, he valued his brother's presence in difficult situations. "No one's expressed any interest in selling," Jacob said firmly, "and I'm curious how you knew to find us here this morning." Morrison's smile never wavered, but something in his eyes sharpened at Jacob's direct challenge. Word gets around in small communities, particularly when properties with development potential come onto the market. "This property isn't on the market," Levi said quietly, finding his voice and stepping up beside his brother. "And it won't be." "I understand the attachment to family land," Morrison replied, his tone shifting to something more understanding, "but no less determined. But sometimes circumstances change. Financial pressures, maintenance costs, family obligations. These things can make even the most sentimental decisions practical ones." The younger man with the camera had been moving around the property while they talked, taking pictures from multiple angles and occasionally making notes on what appeared to be a clipboard filled with technical drawings. His systematic approach suggested they knew more about the farm than casual observers should. "I think you should leave now," Levi said, his quiet voice carrying unmistakable finality. "This is private property, and you don't have permission to be here taking pictures." Morrison nodded, as if he had expected this response, but made no move toward his car. "Of course. But before we go, let me leave you with something to consider." He reached into his coat and pulled out a business card along with what appeared to be a formal document. "This is our preliminary offer for the property, based on current market assessments. I think you'll find it quite generous." Levi took the papers without looking at them, his attention focused entirely on Morrison's face. "What makes you think this property is worth making unsolicited offers for?" "Research," Morrison replied simply. "Good business practice involves understanding the potential of available assets. This location has characteristics that could prove quite valuable to the right developer." After the two men left, Levi and Jacob stood in the cold November air, both processing what had just occurred. The formal offer document remained unopened in Levi's hand, but he could feel its weight as surely as if it were made of lead instead of paper. "They know something," Jacob said finally, echoing Levi's own thoughts. "And whatever it is, they think it's worth enough to make unsolicited offers and take professional photographs." Levi nodded, understanding that his time for private investigation had effectively ended. His brother deserved to know what they were dealing with, and Sarah's practical wisdom about not facing unknown challenges alone was proving more accurate than he had hoped. "Jacob," he said carefully, "I think it's time I showed you what I found in Samuel's bedroom." The foundation stone that Levi discovered while Jacob read Samuel's journal was unlike anything either brother had expected to find. Hidden beneath decades of accumulated debris in the barn's northeast corner, the carved granite block bore symbols that clearly weren't the work of typical Amish craftsmen. "These markings," Jacob said, running his fingers over the deep engravings, "that had been protected by their hiding place. They look almost like surveyor's marks, but more complex. And this one here," he pointed to a symbol that resembled a compass rose surrounded by numbers. "It matches something in Samuel's journal." Levi knelt beside the stone, studying the precision of the carving work. Sarah found similar symbols. On that old property map, 3 points forming a triangle with this kind of marking at each location. He looked up at his brother. Jacob, I think this barn was built as more than just a place to store hay and equipment. The implications of that statement hung between them as they continued examining the foundation stone. If the barn had been constructed for a specific purpose related to these mysterious measurements and symbols, then everything about the property's history needed to be reconsidered. Jacob pulled out Samuel's journal and flipped to a page he had marked while reading. Listen to this entry from 2003. The foundation remembers what the surface has forgotten. Father always said the barn was built where the old one stood, but the stones tell a different story. 3 generations of secrecy, and still the truth waits beneath our feet. Beneath our feet, Levi repeated thoughtfully. He began examining the area around the foundation stone more carefully, brushing away years of accumulated dirt and debris. Jacob, help me clear this section. If Samuel was right about things being hidden beneath the surface, they worked in companionable silence for the next hour, something they hadn't done since they were boys, helping their father with farm work. Despite their recent disagreements about the property, the shared mystery had reminded them why they had once been so close. As they cleared away layers of old straw, broken wood, and accumulated dust, a pattern began to emerge in the barn floor. There, Sarah's voice came from behind them, and both men turned to see her approaching with a thermos of coffee and sandwiches. I wondered how long it would take you two to start working together instead of arguing about what should be done. She had brought a broom and joined their efforts, her practical eye immediately noticing details that their focused digging had missed. This isn't random, she observed, pointing to what they had uncovered. Look how the stones are arranged. It's deliberate, like they're marking something specific. What they revealed over the next 2 hours was a carefully constructed pattern in the barn floor. Stones of different sizes and types arranged in geometric shapes that clearly corresponded to the symbols they had found elsewhere. At the center of the pattern, a section of the floor looked different from the surrounding area, as if it had been disturbed and replaced at some point in the past. We need tools, Levi said finally, understanding that their discovery had reached a point where careful excavation was required. And we need to be systematic about this. If there's something buried here, we don't want to damage it by being careless. Jacob nodded agreement, but his expression showed the conflict between curiosity and concern that Levi had been feeling since finding Samuel's journal. Before we go any further, he said, we need to talk about what happens if we actually find something significant. Those developers didn't show up here by accident, and if we uncover whatever they think is valuable, we're going to be dealing with more attention than any of us are prepared for. It was a sobering observation, one that reminded all three of them that their investigation had moved beyond simple family curiosity into potentially dangerous territory. The combination of Samuel's warnings about being watched, Morrison's unsolicited visit, and now the discovery of deliberate construction beneath the barn floor suggested they were uncovering something that had been carefully hidden for good reasons. Sarah set down her coffee cup and looked at both men with the kind of serious expression that meant she had been thinking while they were digging. I spent some time yesterday at the County Historical Society looking through their records about this property. There are some things that don't add up. She pulled a folder from her bag and spread several photocopied documents on a relatively clean section of the barn floor. The official records show this barn was built in 1923, but I found a newspaper article from 1920 that mentions a fire destroying the old Brenneman barn and the family's plans to rebuild. That suggests there was a previous structure here, just like Samuel wrote in his journal. Jacob leaned over the documents, his business experience making him naturally focused on details and documentation. What else did you find? Property transfers that don't quite make sense, Sarah continued. The farm was deeded to Samuel's father in 1918, but there are references to mineral rights and water rights being retained by the grantor. Those kinds of exceptions usually mean there's something valuable on the land that the original owner didn't want to give up. Mineral rights, Levi repeated, pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to form in his mind. Samuel mentioned something about foundation accounts that he checked on annually. What if the family wasn't just farming this land? What if there was some other source of income that had to be kept secret? The possibility opened up new questions that were both exciting and troubling. If their ancestors had discovered something valuable on the property, minerals, oil, or even artifacts of historical significance, then the secrecy and hidden symbols made perfect sense. But it also explained why outsiders might be interested in forcing a sale. There's something else, Sarah said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. The librarian at the Historical Society mentioned that I wasn't the first person asking questions about this property recently. 2 weeks ago, a man came in asking for the same records I requested. Professional looking, took photographs of everything, and seemed particularly interested in the mineral rights documentation. The silence that followed this revelation was heavy, with implications none of them wanted to voice. Someone else was conducting research into the property's history, someone with resources and motivation that suggested this wasn't casual curiosity. Morrison's people, Jacob said grimly. They've been preparing for this approach for weeks, maybe months. This wasn't a spontaneous visit. It was a calculated business move based on information they've gathered. Levi felt the weight of inherited responsibility settling more heavily on his shoulders. Samuel's warnings about people watching the property suddenly seemed less like an old man's paranoia and more like genuine concern about forces beyond their understanding. "We need to be careful how we proceed," he said finally. "If there really is something valuable hidden here, then we're not just dealing with family history anymore. We're dealing with people who might be willing to go to considerable lengths to get what they want." Sarah began gathering the documents, her movements quick and efficient in the way that meant she was thinking ahead to practical concerns. "Whatever we do next, we don't do it alone, and we don't do it without understanding exactly what we're getting into." As they prepared to leave the barn, Levi took one last look at the pattern they had uncovered in the floor. Tomorrow they would return with proper tools and begin the careful work of excavation that might finally reveal what 3 generations of his family had protected. But tonight he would go home with the growing certainty that Samuel's final gift was about to change their lives in ways none of them could yet imagine. The foundation stone seemed to watch them as they left, its carved symbols holding secrets that had waited decades for the right moment to be revealed. Soon, Levi thought, those secrets would either prove his faith in family wisdom or teach him that some mysteries are better left buried. The brass compass that Levi found embedded in the barn wall 2 days later was a thing of remarkable beauty and obvious age. Unlike the simple instruments used by modern surveyors, this piece showed the careful craftsmanship of an earlier era, with intricate engravings around its face and a weight that spoke of solid construction designed to last generations. More importantly, it worked exactly as Samuel's journal had promised. "Stand here," Levi called to Jacob and Sarah, positioning himself at the foundation stone they had uncovered. According to Samuel's notes, the compass should point to specific locations when held at each of the marked stones. Sarah watched skeptically as he held the antique instrument steady, waiting for its needle to settle. "Levi, compasses point to magnetic north. They don't point to buried treasure like something out of a children's adventure story." But as the needle found its position, it became clear that this wasn't an ordinary compass. Instead of pointing steadily northward, the instrument's needle swung to indicate a bearing that led directly toward the southeast corner of the property, where the old property map had shown one of the mysterious symbols. "That's not possible," Jacob said, moving closer to examine the compass himself. Unless, he paused, his business experience with precision instruments making him consider alternatives that were less dramatic but more plausible. Unless this has been modified somehow, adjusted to point to a specific magnetic anomaly instead of true north. Levi nodded, understanding beginning to dawn. What if our ancestors planted something metallic at specific points around the property? Something significant enough to affect compass readings, but small enough to remain hidden. They spent the morning moving between the 3 points indicated on the old map, using the compass to confirm what Samuel's journal had suggested. At each location, the instrument pointed to the next position in sequence, creating a triangular pattern that encompassed the most important buildings on the farm. The southeast point led them to a section of fence line that looked unremarkable, but revealed its secrets under closer examination. Hidden among the normal fence posts was one that appeared to be made of a different material, heavier, with a slightly different color that had been disguised by decades of weathering. Iron, Jacob determined after examining it closely. A solid iron post buried deep enough to affect compass readings, but disguised to look like ordinary wood fencing. The northwest point was more challenging to locate, hidden in what appeared to be a natural rock outcropping near the edge of the property. But the compass led them directly to a section where someone had carefully concealed another iron marker, this one shaped like a natural stone, but clearly artificial under close inspection. "This is sophisticated work," Sarah observed, her initial skepticism giving way to admiration for the planning and execution their ancestors had demonstrated. Creating a navigation system that could remain hidden for decades while still being accurate enough to guide the right person to specific locations. But it was when they returned to the barn and used the compass from the other 2 points that the full scope of the system became apparent. Each position pointed not just to the next marker, but to precise measurements that, when calculated together, indicated specific distances and directions that narrowed their search area to a space no larger than a few square feet. "There," Levi said, marking the ground with a stick where the compass bearings intersected. "According to this system, whatever they buried should be right here." The spot was unremarkable, a section of barn floor that looked identical to the surrounding area, with no obvious signs of disturbance or special construction. But as they began carefully removing the surface layer of dirt and debris, differences became apparent. The soil beneath the surface was different from the surrounding area, darker, less compacted, showing clear signs of having been disturbed and replaced at some point in the past. More significantly, about 2 feet down, their careful digging revealed the edge of something that definitely didn't belong in ordinary barn floor construction. "Metal," Jacob said, his voice tight with excitement and apprehension. "Something large, deliberately buried, and protected by what looks like waxed canvas." They worked more carefully now, understanding that whatever they were uncovering had been hidden with great care and for important reasons. As more of the object became visible, it became clear they had found a substantial metal container, roughly the size of a large toolbox, wrapped in multiple layers of protective material. "We should stop here," Sarah said suddenly, her practical nature asserting itself as the implications of their discovery became real. "Before we open whatever this is, we need to think about what we're doing and what the consequences might be." Levi sat back on his heels, understanding the wisdom of her caution. They had found something that had been deliberately hidden by previous generations of his family, something significant enough to warrant an elaborate concealment system and careful protection from the elements. Opening it would cross a line. From investigation into active participation in whatever secrets his ancestors had been guarding. Samuel's journal mentioned threats. He said quietly, "People watching the property, asking questions, making offers to buy. If we open this container and find something valuable, we're going to be dealing with the same pressures he faced." Jacob nodded, his earlier enthusiasm tempered by realistic concerns about what they might be unleashing. And if it's something that should remain hidden, documents that could embarrass the family or evidence of activities that weren't entirely legal, then we could be creating problems that go beyond simple monetary considerations. But even as they discussed the wisdom of proceeding, all three knew they had already passed the point of no return. The container lay before them like a question that demanded an answer, and the mystery that had drawn them this far wouldn't be satisfied by careful preservation of ignorance. "Whatever we find," Levi said finally, "we face it together, and we honor whatever intentions our family had when they put it here." As Sarah handed him the tools they would need to carefully extract and examine the container, Levi felt the weight of generations of family decisions converging on this moment. In a few minutes, they would know whether Samuel's faith in his judgment had been justified, and whether the burden of family secrets was something he was strong enough to carry. The afternoon sun slanted through the barn's broken roof, illuminating their work with golden light that seemed to whisper of revelations, waiting just beneath the surface of everything they thought they knew about their family's history. The steel box that emerged from its protective wrappings was larger and heavier than any of them had expected, its surface showing the kind of careful maintenance that spoke of regular attention over many years. Unlike something that had been buried and forgotten, this container showed signs of periodic cleaning and care, suggesting Samuel had accessed it regularly throughout his life. "It's not locked," Sarah observed, running her fingers along the edges where a simple but sturdy latch mechanism held the lid secure. "But there's some kind of seal around the edges. Wax, maybe, to keep moisture out." Jacob examined the seal more closely, noting the precision with which it had been applied. "This has been opened and resealed recently, within the last few years. I'd guess Samuel was definitely maintaining whatever's in here." Levi's hands trembled slightly as he worked to break the seal without damaging either the container or its contents. The weight of the moment pressed on all three of them, the understanding that opening this box would fundamentally change their relationship with family history and their responsibilities to future generations. The lid opened with a soft whisper of escaping air, revealing contents that none of them had anticipated. Instead of the coins or jewelry they might have expected from a hidden family treasure, the box contained documents, dozens of them, carefully organized in folders and wrapped in oilcloth for protection. "Land deeds," Sarah breathed, lifting the top folder and opening it carefully. "But not for this property. These are for—" She paused, studying the legal descriptions with growing amazement. "Jacob, look at this. These are ownership documents for properties all over Lancaster County." As they examined the contents more thoroughly, a picture emerged of family wealth and business activities that completely contradicted everything they thought they knew about their ancestors. The documents revealed ownership of multiple properties, mineral rights extending across thousands of acres, and investment certificates for businesses and ventures spanning several decades. "My God," Jacob whispered, holding up a stock certificate dated 1952. "This is for Pennsylvania Railroad Company. 5,000 shares." He looked up at his brother with an expression of stunned disbelief. "Levi, do you understand what this means? Even accounting for stock splits and mergers over the years, this single certificate could be worth more than this farm," Levi finished, his voice barely audible as he studied another folder containing what appeared to be mining claims and water rights documentation, "more than all our farms combined." But it was Sarah who found the document that explained everything, a letter addressed to future generations of the Brenneman family in handwriting they recognized as belonging to Levi's grandfather. "Listen to this," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were discovering. "My dear family, if you are reading this, then the time has come to understand the true nature of our heritage and the responsibilities that come with it. What appears to the world as simple farming has been, for 3 generations, a deliberate concealment of wealth that must be protected from those who would use it unwisely. She paused, looking at both men to ensure they were absorbing the implications of what she was reading. The farm has always been profitable, but not from agriculture alone. Our ancestors discovered mineral deposits and water rights that have provided income for decades. This income has been carefully invested and grown, always with an eye toward preserving it for future generations who would demonstrate the wisdom and character necessary to handle such responsibility. Jacob was studying another folder, his business training helping him understand the financial documents in ways that neither Levi nor Sarah could fully grasp. These mineral rights agreements, he said slowly, they're still active, current. Someone has been collecting income from these properties and investments all along. Samuel, Levi realized. That's how he could afford to maintain this property without visible income. That's why he always seemed comfortable financially despite living so simply. The magnitude of their discovery was overwhelming, but it was the final document in the collection that truly changed everything they thought they understood about their situation. Wrapped separately and marked with Samuel's handwriting was a comprehensive financial statement dated just 3 months before his death. $200 million, Sarah read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. The total current value of family assets, including properties, investments, mineral rights, and accumulated interest, is approximately $200 million. The silence that followed stretched until it became almost unbearable. They had gone from believing they had inherited a worthless farm to discovering they were among the wealthiest families in Pennsylvania, all while living lives of deliberate simplicity that had hidden the truth from even their closest family members. "This explains Morrison," Jacob said finally, his business mind immediately grasping the practical implications. "If word has gotten out about mineral rights or property values, then development companies would be very interested in forcing a sale. What we thought was pressure about a rundown farm was actually an attempt to acquire assets worth hundreds of millions." Levi found himself thinking about the responsibility Samuel had placed on his shoulders, understanding now why his uncle had chosen so carefully who would inherit this burden. The wealth represented power and options that could transform not just their immediate family, but their entire community. It also represented the kind of secret that people might kill for, and the kind of responsibility that could destroy a family if handled unwisely. "We can't tell anyone about this," he said quietly, the words feeling strange even as he spoke them. "Not yet. Not until we understand what we're dealing with and what Samuel expected us to do with this knowledge." Sarah was already rewrapping the documents with the same care Samuel had shown, her practical nature recognizing that secrecy had protected this wealth for generations and would need to continue protecting it now. "The question is whether we can trust ourselves to handle this wisely. Wealth this significant changes people, changes families. It creates obligations and enemies we've never had to consider." As they carefully resealed the container and returned it to its hiding place, all three understood that their lives had been fundamentally altered. They were no longer simple farmers dealing with a challenging inheritance. They were the guardians of a family fortune that carried responsibilities and dangers they were only beginning to comprehend. The afternoon light seemed different as they emerged from the barn, as if the world itself had shifted subtly around them. Nothing looked the same when viewed through the lens of their new understanding, and the simple farm that had seemed like such a burden now appeared to be the most elaborate disguise they had ever encountered. The master ledger that Levi discovered in the main vault 3 days later revealed the true scope of what his family had been protecting and explained why Samuel had been so careful about choosing the right heir to continue their guardianship. Vishu. Vault itself had been hidden beneath the barn's foundation with the kind of engineering precision that spoke of professional construction and serious intent. Accessible only through a concealed entrance that required the specific measurements from the compass system, It contained not just documents and certificates, but artifacts and evidence of business activities that spanned nearly a century. "This isn't just family wealth," Sarah said. Her voice filled with awe as she examined the carefully organized records that filled multiple filing cabinets. "This is a business operation that has been running continuously since the 1920s, managed by each generation in secret while maintaining the appearance of simple farming." The master ledger, bound in leather and meticulously maintained in multiple hands over the decades, told a story that was both inspiring and sobering. Levi's great-grandfather had discovered significant mineral deposits on the property during the Depression, but instead of selling the rights for immediate profit, he had developed a long-term strategy for extracting maximum value while avoiding the attention that sudden wealth might bring. "Look at this entry from 1934, Jacob said, reading from the ledger with growing amazement. "Coal mining rights leased to Pennsylvania Mining Consortium, annual payments of $12,000 with escalation clauses tied to market prices. That would be equivalent to hundreds of thousands in today's money. But the coal rights were only the beginning." As they worked through the records, a picture emerged of investments and business ventures that had grown steadily over decades. Real estate acquisitions during economic downturns, stock purchases in companies that would later become major corporations, and mineral rights across 3 counties that continued generating substantial income. Water rights, Sarah discovered, pulling out a folder that contained agreements with multiple municipalities. "The family has been selling water access to growing communities throughout Lancaster County. Some of these contracts run for 99 years, with income that adjusts for inflation and population growth." The sophistication of the operation was staggering. Each generation had added to the wealth while maintaining absolute secrecy about the source of their comfortable but not ostentatious lifestyle. The farm itself was profitable enough to support the family's visible needs, while the hidden income had been systematically invested and grown under the management of discreet financial advisors who understood the importance of confidentiality. "Here's the current portfolio summary," Levi said, finding a document that Samuel had updated just months before his death. $237 million in total assets, including active mineral rights, real estate holdings, investment portfolios, and cash reserves. But it was the section of the ledger marked Security Protocols that explained why such elaborate secrecy had been necessary. Throughout the decades, there had been multiple attempts by outside parties to discover and exploit the family's hidden wealth. Government investigations during wartime, corporate espionage from competing mining interests, and more recently, sophisticated financial research by development companies seeking to force advantageous property sales. Samuel wasn't paranoid, Jacob realized, reading through reports of surveillance, attempted break-ins, and legal challenges that had been quietly defeated over the years. The threats were real, and they're still ongoing. The most sobering discovery was a folder marked Current Threats that Samuel had maintained until the end of his life. Morrison Development Group was prominently featured, along with detailed reports on their business practices, financial backing, and history of acquiring properties through pressure tactics when traditional negotiations failed. "They know," Sarah said, studying photographs and documents that showed Morrison's people had been conducting research into the property for more than 2 years. "Maybe not the exact details, but they know there's something valuable here worth pursuing aggressively." More troubling was evidence that Morrison wasn't working alone. The documents revealed connections to larger financial interests that had been systematically researching and acquiring mineral rights throughout Pennsylvania, often using legal and financial pressure to force sales from families who didn't understand the true value of what they owned. "This is why Samuel chose you," Jacob said to his brother, the pieces of the puzzle finally forming a complete picture. "He needed someone with the integrity to resist pressure, the intelligence to understand the complexity of what he was passing on, and the family connections to ensure the secret could be maintained for another generation. Levi felt the weight of that responsibility settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. The wealth was extraordinary, but it came with obligations and dangers that would affect not just him and Sarah, but their children and grandchildren for decades to come. "There's something else," Sarah said, pulling out a folder that had been sealed with wax and marked in Samuel's handwriting, with instructions that it should only be opened if the family's position became untenable. Samuel's emergency protocols, plans for what to do if secrecy becomes impossible or if the threats become too dangerous to manage. The emergency folder contained contingency plans that Samuel had developed for various scenarios, from gradual revelation of wealth to immediate liquidation and relocation if family safety became threatened. There were established relationships with attorneys and financial advisors who could be activated quickly, safe deposit boxes in multiple states containing backup documentation, and even preliminary arrangements for witness protection if corporate or criminal threats escalated beyond management. He thought of everything, Levi marveled, understanding now why Samuel had seemed so confident in his final months, despite the obvious pressures he was facing. Every possible threat, every scenario we might need to handle. He spent decades preparing for this transition, but the final document in the emergency folder was the most significant. A detailed assessment of each family member's suitability for sharing knowledge of the hidden wealth. Samuel had analyzed their personalities, their financial pressures, their ability to maintain secrecy, and their likely reactions to sudden access to vast resources. Jacob's assessment was honest but sobering. Strong business instincts and natural leadership abilities, but tendency toward immediate action rather than long-term strategy. Might struggle with the patience required for multi-generational wealth preservation. Risk of inadvertent revelation through lifestyle changes or business investments. He was right, Jacob admitted, reading his uncle's evaluation of his character with uncomfortable recognition. If I had inherited this responsibility alone, I probably would have made decisions that exposed us within the first year. Levi's evaluation was more optimistic. Natural temperament for long-term thinking and careful decision-making. Strong family values, and demonstrated ability to resist pressure for immediate gratification, most likely to maintain security while developing wisdom necessary for responsible stewardship. As evening approached and they prepared to secure the vault and return home, the magnitude of what they had discovered continued to overwhelm their ability to process it completely. They were no longer just farmers dealing with an inheritance. They had become the guardians of a family legacy that had been carefully built and protected across 4 generations. The ruined farm that had seemed like such a burden was actually the most sophisticated camouflage they had ever encountered, hiding wealth and resources that made them among the most financially powerful families in the region. But with that power came responsibilities and dangers that would test everything. They believed about themselves and their ability to honor the trust that Samuel had placed in them. The trust documents that Samuel's attorney delivered to Levi's home on a gray December morning confirmed what the vault had revealed, while simultaneously creating the crisis that would test everything the family had learned about themselves. Attorney Harrison Whitfield was a man in his 70s whose careful demeanor and expensive but understated clothing suggested someone accustomed to handling significant and confidential matters. He had driven from Philadelphia specifically to meet with Levi, bringing with him a briefcase full of legal documents that would formalize Levi's inheritance and establish his authority over assets that most people couldn't imagine possessing. "Your uncle was a remarkable man," Whitfield said, as they gathered around Levi's kitchen table, his voice carrying the respect of someone who had worked with Samuel for more than 30 years. His instructions were quite specific about the timing and manner of this transfer. He wanted to ensure you had time to discover and understand the scope of your inheritance before dealing with the legal formalities. The primary document was a trust agreement that named Levi as the sole beneficiary and administrator of what was formerly called the Brenneman Family Preservation Trust. The language was dense with legal terminology, but the essential meaning was clear. Levi now had complete authority over assets worth more than $200 million, along with the absolute responsibility for their protection and growth. The trust structure provides certain protections, Whitfield explained, his finger tracing relevant sections of the document. Personal liability limitations, tax advantages, and most importantly, legal barriers against forced disclosure or seizure, except under very specific circumstances. But it was the supplementary documents that revealed the true complexity of Levi's new position. Along with wealth came obligations to continue the mineral rights agreements that provided ongoing income, to maintain the secrecy that had protected the family for generations, and to begin preparing the next generation for eventual succession. Samuel was quite concerned about external pressures, Whitfield continued, pulling out a folder marked Immediate Threats Assessment. He asked me to provide you with this analysis of current legal and financial challenges that may require your attention. The assessment was sobering. Morrison Development Group had been conducting increasingly aggressive research into the property, including attempts to access county records, utility company surveys, and even hiring private investigators to observe family activities. More concerning were indications that Morrison was backed by a consortium of investors who had been systematically targeting properties with suspected mineral wealth throughout Pennsylvania. They're not going to simply accept your refusal to sell, Whitfield warned. Organizations like this typically escalate their approaches when initial negotiations fail. You should be prepared for legal challenges, financial pressure tactics, and potentially more invasive forms of investigation. Sarah had been listening quietly, but now she spoke with the practical concern that had guided their family through 20 years of marriage. What kind of legal challenges? Are we vulnerable to eminent domain claims or environmental regulations that could force disclosure? Unlikely, Whitfield replied, but not impossible. The trust structure provides significant protection, but determined adversaries with substantial resources can find ways to create pressure through regulatory agencies, tax investigations, or civil litigation based on various pretexts. Jacob, who had been studying the financial documents with his businessman's eye for detail, looked up with an expression of growing concern. These mineral rights agreements, they're all structured to avoid publicity, but they must create paper trails that sophisticated investigators could follow if they knew what to look for. Exactly, Whitfield confirmed. Samuel was meticulous about legal compliance and proper documentation, but absolute secrecy becomes more difficult as outside pressures increase. You may need to make decisions about how much of your position you're willing to reveal in order to protect the rest. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching on the gravel road that led to their farmhouse. Through the kitchen window, they could see two cars, Morrison's familiar dark sedan, followed by a larger vehicle with government license plates that immediately raised everyone's tension level. Were you expecting anyone from county or state? Agencies? Whitfield asked, his professional calm showing the first signs of concern. No, Levi replied, moving to the window for a better view of their unexpected visitors. And the timing of this visit, right when we're discussing legal protections, doesn't seem like coincidence. Morrison emerged from his vehicle accompanied by the younger man who had taken photographs during their previous visit, but this time they were joined by two people in official-looking suits who carried briefcases and the kind of confident bearing that suggested government authority. State Environmental Regulatory Commission, Sarah read from identification badges that were visible even at a distance, and someone from the county assessor's office. Whitfield immediately began gathering the trust documents and returning them to his briefcase, his movements quick and efficient. Under no circumstances should you allow them to enter your home without proper warrants, and you should limit any discussion of property details until we understand what authority they're claiming and what information they're seeking. The group approached the front porch with Morrison clearly leading the conversation, his body language suggesting he was explaining who lived here and what they might expect to find. The government officials listened with the kind of professional attention that indicated this wasn't a casual inquiry. "Mr. Brenneman," Morrison called out when Levi appeared on the porch, his tone carrying more authority than during their previous encounters. "We have some questions about your property that require immediate attention. I've brought some colleagues from state and county agencies who need to conduct an assessment." "What kind of assessment?" Levi replied, stepping outside but keeping the front door closed behind him. "And under what authority?" One of the government officials stepped forward, producing identification and what appeared to be official paperwork. "Environmental Protection Agency. We've received reports of possible groundwater contamination from historical mining activities on your property. We need to conduct soil and water testing to ensure public safety compliance." The claim was plausible enough to be legally defensible, while being vague enough to provide broad investigative authority. Levi recognized it as exactly the kind of regulatory pressure that Whitfield had warned them to expect. "I'll need to see your warrants and have my attorney review your authority before allowing any testing on private property," he replied, grateful for Whitfield's presence, even though the attorney remained inside and out of sight. "Mr. Brenneman," the county assessor's representative interjected, "we also have concerns about property tax assessments that may not reflect current land values. Recent surveys suggest your property boundaries and mineral rights may be more extensive than county records indicate." That was the real threat, Levi realized. If county assessments were based on the true value of mineral rights and property holdings, the resulting tax obligations would be enormous and would create public records that would reveal the scope of family wealth. "All property taxes are current and properly calculated based on county assessments," he replied carefully. "If you believe there are errors in the records, I'm sure my attorney can work with your office to address any discrepancies through proper legal channels." Morrison had been listening to this exchange with growing impatience, and now he stepped forward with the kind of aggressive confidence that suggested he believed he held stronger cards than he had previously revealed. "Mr. Brenneman, let's stop pretending that this is about environmental compliance or property taxes. We know there's significant mineral wealth on your property, and we know your family has been hiding the true extent of their holdings for decades. What we're offering is a chance to resolve this situation through voluntary cooperation, rather than forced disclosure through legal proceedings." The statement hung in the cold December air like a challenge that demanded response. Morrison had revealed that his interest in the property was based on specific knowledge of family wealth, not speculation or general development interest. More troubling, he had implied that legal mechanisms existed to force disclosure if voluntary cooperation wasn't forthcoming. "I think this conversation is over," Levi said firmly, understanding that anything he said from this point forward could be used to support whatever legal strategy Morrison's group was planning. "Any further communication should go through my attorney." As he turned to go back inside, Morrison's voice followed him with a warning that chilled him more than the December weather. "Mr. Brenneman, you have 48 hours to reconsider our offer. After that, we'll be filing formal complaints with environmental and tax authorities that will require much more invasive investigation than anything we've discussed today. I don't think you'll enjoy the kind of attention that official investigations bring to family financial matters." Inside the house, Whitfield was already on his phone, making calls to colleagues who specialized in regulatory defense and environmental law. The crisis that Samuel had spent decades trying to prevent was beginning, and the next 48 hours would determine whether generations of careful family stewardship could survive the kind of legal and financial pressure that Morrison's consortium was prepared to bring to bear. The sheriff's badge that Whitfield produced from Samuel's safety deposit box changed everything about Levi's legal position and his family's ability to resist the pressure that Morrison's consortium was applying. Your great-grandfather wasn't just a farmer who discovered mineral wealth, Whitfield explained, as they examined the tarnished silver badge and the commission documents that accompanied it. He was a duly appointed deputy sheriff for Lancaster County, with law enforcement authority that, according to these documents, was never formally revoked. The badge bore the name Heinrich Brenneman and was dated 1923, but more importantly, it came with documentation showing that Heinrich's appointment had included special jurisdiction over mineral rights enforcement and property protection, areas where county resources were limited. This is extraordinary, Whitfield continued, studying the legal language with growing excitement. The Commission specifically grants authority to investigate and prevent illegal mineral extraction, property fraud, and conspiracy to defraud landowners of their legal rights. If this appointment was properly recorded and never revoked, then some of these powers may have been inherited along with the property. Jacob examined the badge with the careful attention of someone who had learned to look for details that others might miss. Samuel kept this in a safety deposit box specifically for emergency use. He must have understood that it could provide legal protection if the family's position ever became untenable. More than protection, Whitfield said, pulling out additional documents that revealed the full scope of what Heinrich's appointment had encompassed. Active authority to investigate suspected fraud and to request county and state assistance in enforcing property rights. If Morrison's group is using illegal or deceptive practices to pressure you into selling, this commission could provide grounds for having them investigated rather than defended against. The timing couldn't have been more critical. Morrison's 48-hour ultimatum was set to expire in 6 hours, and the family had spent the last 2 days preparing for legal challenges that now appeared to be unnecessary. Sarah had been coordinating with neighbors and community members who had also received inquiries from Morrison's people, documenting a pattern of pressure tactics that went well beyond legitimate business negotiations. The evidence she had gathered painted a picture of systematic harassment designed to force property sales through intimidation rather than fair market negotiations. They've been using the same approach throughout the county, she reported, spreading out statements from 5 different families who had been targeted by Morrison's organization. Implied threats about regulatory investigations, suggestions that tax assessments would be dramatically increased, and in 2 cases, actual harassment of family members who refused to cooperate. The pattern suggested that Morrison's group was operating outside legal boundaries in ways that could make them vulnerable to investigation rather than positioning them to investigate the Brenneman family. If Heinrich's law enforcement authority could be activated, the power dynamic would shift dramatically. The question, Whitfield said, is whether you're prepared to exercise that authority, taking on a law enforcement role, even one with historical precedent, means accepting public responsibilities that could compromise the secrecy your family has maintained for generations. Levi held the badge in his hands, feeling the weight of both metal and history. The simple piece of silver represented more than just legal authority. It was a symbol of his great-grandfather's willingness to take public risks to protect family interests, and a reminder that sometimes preservation required action rather than passive resistance. What would it involve practically? He asked, understanding that this decision would affect not just the current crisis, but the family's relationship with their community for years to come. First, reactivation of the commission through county records. Whitfield explained. The legal precedent exists, but it would need to be formally acknowledged by current authorities. Second, documentation of Morrison's illegal practices and submission of formal complaints that would trigger official investigation. Jacob was studying the evidence Sarah had gathered, his business experience helping him see patterns that supported their legal strategy. These pressure tactics they've been using, if even half of what these families are reporting is accurate, Morrison's group has violated multiple state and federal laws regarding property acquisition and intimidation. More than that, Sarah added, I found evidence that they've been filing false environmental reports and making fraudulent claims about property contamination to pressure other families into quick sales. That's criminal fraud, not just aggressive business practices. The sound of vehicles approaching interrupted their planning session, and through the window they could see Morrison's familiar sedan, accompanied by what appeared to be a county sheriff's vehicle. The official presence suggested that Morrison was preparing to follow through on his threats about regulatory investigation. This is it, Levi said quietly, understanding that the next few minutes would determine whether his family maintained control over their situation or became subject to whatever legal challenges Morrison had prepared. If we're going to use Heinrich's authority, it has to be now. Whitfield nodded, gathering the commission documents and preparing to present them to whatever officials Morrison had brought with him. Remember, you're not defending against accusations. You're exercising legitimate law enforcement authority to investigate suspected criminal activity targeting landowners in your jurisdiction. As the group approached the house, Levi pinned the sheriff's badge to his coat and stepped onto the porch with the confidence of someone who finally understood the full scope of his legal position. The scared farmer who had been trying to protect family secrets was gone, replaced by a deputy sheriff with authority to investigate the very people who had been threatening his family. Morrison's surprise was immediate and visible when he saw the badge and the official documents that Whitfield presented to the county sheriff's deputy who had accompanied him. Deputy Brenneman is exercising his inherited law enforcement authority to investigate reports of illegal property acquisition practices in Lancaster County, Whitfield announced formally. We have evidence of fraud, intimidation, and conspiracy to deprive landowners of their legal rights, and we're requesting official support for a full investigation. The tables had turned completely. Instead of defending against Morrison's accusations, Levi was now in a position to demand answers about practices that appeared to violate multiple laws. The quiet farmer had become the authority figure, and Morrison's confident aggression suddenly looked like exactly what it was: criminal behavior that would not be tolerated in a community where law enforcement took property rights seriously. The original land grant that Whitfield retrieved from the state archives that afternoon ended all legal challenges to the Brenneman family's position and established Levi's authority in terms that even Morrison's expensive lawyers couldn't dispute. The document, signed by Pennsylvania's territorial governor in 1847, granted Heinrich Brenneman and his heirs not just ownership of the property, but permanent and irrevocable rights to all minerals, water, and natural resources beneath the surface. More significantly, it included language that specifically protected these rights from seizure, forced sale, or regulatory interference, except in cases of clear and present danger to public safety. This is unprecedented, the county sheriff's deputy admitted as he examined the grant under Whitfield's guidance. I've never seen mineral rights documentation with this level of legal protection. It effectively makes the property sovereign with regard to subsurface resources. Morrison's confidence had evaporated completely as the scope of the Brenneman family's legal position became clear. The environmental and tax challenges he had threatened were meaningless against a land grant that predated most regulatory authority and specifically protected the family's rights from exactly the kind of interference his consortium had been planning. The fraudulent environmental reports your organization filed with state agencies constitute criminal violations of multiple statutes, Levi said, exercising his law enforcement authority with growing confidence. You've also engaged in intimidation, tactics against landowners that violate federal laws regarding property rights and fair dealing. Jacob had been documenting Morrison's illegal activities with the systematic approach of someone who understood that thorough evidence collection would be necessary for successful prosecution. We have statements from 5 families, recorded, conversations and documentary evidence of false claims made to regulatory agencies. This isn't marginal behavior. It's a clear pattern of criminal conspiracy. The county deputy was taking notes and requesting backup support as the evidence mounted. What had begun as Morrison's attempt to pressure a simple farming family into selling had become a law enforcement investigation into organized criminal activity targeting multiple landowners throughout Lancaster County. "Mr. Morrison," the deputy said formally, "you're going to need to accompany me to the county office for questioning regarding these allegations. Your associates will also need to make themselves available for investigation." But it was Sarah who delivered the final blow to Morrison's operation, producing evidence she had been gathering quietly while the men focused on legal and law enforcement aspects of their response. "I contacted the State Attorney General's office yesterday," she announced, holding up official documents that made Morrison's face go pale. "They've been investigating similar property acquisition schemes in 3 other counties. Your organization is already under federal investigation for racketeering and conspiracy to defraud landowners." The revelation that Morrison's group was already under investigation for similar activities elsewhere transformed the situation from a local property dispute into part of a broader criminal case that would likely result in federal charges and substantial prison sentences. "You played this exactly wrong," Levi told Morrison, as county officers prepared to escort him away. "If you had approached us honestly about purchasing mineral rights or entering into legitimate business partnerships, we might have been able to find mutually beneficial arrangements. Instead, you chose intimidation and fraud, and now you'll face the legal consequences of those choices." As the official vehicles departed with Morrison and his associates, the quiet of the December afternoon settled over the farm like a blessing. The crisis that had threatened to destroy generations of careful family stewardship had been resolved not through hiding or compromise, but through the exercise of legitimate authority that the family had possessed all along. Jacob shook his head in amazement as they watched the last of the official vehicles disappear down the gravel road. Samuel knew this would happen eventually. That's why he preserved Heinrich's commission and kept all the documentation we needed. He was preparing us for exactly this kind of challenge. More than that, Whitfield added, he was ensuring that, when the challenge came, you would have the legal tools and moral authority to respond effectively. The Law Enforcement Commission wasn't just about protection. It was about establishing your family's position as guardians of legitimate rights, rather than people hiding questionable wealth. Levi removed the sheriff's badge and examined it one final time before returning it to its protective case. The crisis was over, but the responsibilities it had revealed would continue for the rest of his life. He was no longer just a farmer who had inherited a burden. He was the proven guardian of family heritage and community values, with both the authority and the wisdom necessary to protect what mattered most. As evening approached and they prepared to return to the normal rhythms of farm life, the weight of inherited responsibility felt different than it had just days earlier. Instead of a burden that might crush him, it had become a source of strength that had enabled him to protect not just his own family, but his entire community from those who would exploit honest people for financial gain. The foundation had indeed remembered what the surface had forgotten, and now that memory would guide future generations toward wisdom rather than simply toward wealth. The new foundation stone that Levi placed at the restored barn's entrance 6 months later bore an inscription that would guide future generations of his family toward the wisdom that wealth without character could never provide. In memory of those who preserved what mattered most, and in honor of those who will continue the guardianship, may wisdom guide prosperity, and may prosperity serve wisdom. The stone itself was carved from granite quarried on their own property, using tools and techniques that honored the craftsmanship of their ancestors, while embracing the resources that modern knowledge and careful investment had made available. Like everything else they had accomplished during the months since Morrison's defeat, it represented a balance between preservation and progress that Samuel would have understood and approved. The farm that had seemed like such a burden the previous autumn now stood as a testament to the power of patient restoration, guided by adequate resources. The barn was not only structurally sound, but beautiful, its lines clean and purposeful, while maintaining the architectural integrity that connected it to generations of family history. The house had been restored with care that honored its heritage, while incorporating modern conveniences that would serve future generations. But the most significant changes weren't visible to casual observers. The mineral rights agreements that had provided income for decades had been renegotiated on terms that would ensure sustainable revenue for the next century, while maintaining the environmental protections that mattered to the community. The investment portfolio had been restructured under professional management that prioritized long-term growth over short-term profits, ensuring that the family's wealth would continue growing while supporting causes that aligned with their values. Sarah stood beside her husband as they watched their grandchildren play in the restored farmyard, her practical wisdom having guided them through the challenges of managing sudden wealth without losing sight of what made their lives meaningful. "Samuel would be proud," she said quietly, referring not just to the physical restoration, but to the way they had navigated the responsibilities that came with their inheritance. "We kept the secret when it needed to be kept, but we also stood up when standing up was necessary." The legal resolution of Morrison's criminal activities had brought unexpected benefits beyond simply ending the immediate threat to their family. The federal investigation had resulted in the recovery of millions of dollars in fraudulent property acquisitions, much of which had been returned to families who had been victimized by similar schemes. Levi's role in exposing the conspiracy had earned him recognition from law enforcement agencies and respect from community members who had previously seen him as overly sentimental about a worthless inheritance. Jacob approached from the direction of the restored barn, his expression showing the satisfaction of someone who had found his proper role in a complex family enterprise. The discovery that their uncle had been correct about his business instincts being better suited for immediate challenges rather than long-term strategy had led to a partnership arrangement that used his strengths while protecting against his weaknesses. The environmental consulting firm finished their assessment, he reported, referring to the comprehensive study they had commissioned to ensure their mineral extraction activities met the highest standards for environmental protection. Not only are we in full compliance with all regulations, but they're recommending our operation as a model for sustainable resource extraction. That recommendation had led to consulting opportunities that were both profitable and meaningful, allowing the family to share their knowledge with other landowners while building relationships that strengthened their community rather than isolating them within it. The cousins who had initially mocked Levi's decision to keep the farm had become valuable partners in managing the various enterprises that the family's wealth had made possible. David's interest in real estate development had found expression in affordable housing projects that served their community's needs while generating reasonable profits. Young Samuel's enthusiasm for modern business practices had been channeled into technology investments that honored traditional values while embracing innovation. But perhaps the most satisfying development had been the establishment of the Brenneman Family Foundation, which used a portion of their annual income to support education, environmental protection, and economic development throughout Lancaster County. The foundation allowed them to be public about their commitment to community welfare while maintaining privacy about the full scope of their resources. As evening approached and extended family members gathered for the weekly dinner that had become a tradition since the resolution of the Morrison crisis, Levi reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The broken-down farm that had seemed like such a burden had become the foundation for a legacy that would serve their community for generations. The vault beneath the barn now contained not just the accumulated wealth of previous generations, but comprehensive plans for its continued growth and distribution. Future heirs would inherit not just money and property, but a proven system for managing responsibility and a clear understanding of the obligations that came with family wealth. Children's laughter echoed from the restored farmyard as the next generation played games that their grandparents would have recognized, building memories on land that had been blessed by the wisdom and sacrifice of those who came before them. The foundation stones that supported their prosperity were built not just from granite and careful investment, but from the character and values that had guided 4 generations of careful stewardship. As stars emerged in the clear December sky, Levi understood that Samuel's final gift hadn't been wealth. It had been the opportunity to prove that some families could be trusted with abundance because they had learned that true prosperity comes from serving purposes larger than immediate comfort or personal gain. The secret was safe, the legacy was secure, and the foundation would endure because it had been built on principles that transcended any single generation's needs or wants. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight the satisfaction of duty fulfilled and wisdom honored was enough to carry them through whatever the future might hold.